Okay. Hello and welcome to Insight. I'm Kusum Wijetilleke. My guest today is Tabita Rosendal. She is a lecturer and a researcher and an academic from Denmark, but she is studying at the University of Lund in Sweden. And her subject topic and area is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and investments in Asia. So Tabita, thank you very much for being here on Insight. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I want to just give our audience an idea. You're from Denmark.
Yes.
So you're Danish and you're studying in Sweden, but your subject area is China, and specifically what China is doing in Asia with terms of its investments and its political involvements. So can you give us briefly an idea of why you started studying about China, and is there any footprint of China in Denmark or in Sweden that made you think of this in this situation? Or?
Well, to make a long story a little bit shorter, I can say that I became very interested in China from a very, very early age, actually. It's always a big topic, geopolitically and otherwise in Denmark. We're also quite small state, so it became interesting from an early age to look into Chinese politics for me. And after I visited China a few times and I lived there over several occasions, I just became very drawn to the culture and the language and the history of the country. Then a little bit later, I started doing more political research, and generally speaking, I think there's been a sort of misrepresentation when it comes to China in a lot of different countries. It's not to say that all communications and all presentations about China are wrong or anything like this, but just that our impressions of China have often been wrongfully skewed when it comes to China's political footprint and all of these things because of geopolitical rivalries and tensions. So me being from a small state, quite outside of the purview of the US and other Western players, but also outside of China's direct purview, I figured it would be interesting for me to conduct research in a more nuanced and I call it non-West-centric manner.
Right.
So that is the idea.
Could you tell me roughly now you're in Sri Lanka, so you've clearly seen the Chinese footprint growing in Sri Lanka, the Belt and Road Initiative and the political involvements. Could you tell us briefly why you chose Sri Lanka, amongst other places, to come and do some research?
Right. So, previously during my MA studies, I actually focused on South Asia in terms of Pakistan. And that was what first drew my attention to Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka, obviously, is a very interesting case because in 2017, Sri Lanka became known as the sort of epitome of Chinese debt trap diplomacy, especially when the China Merchants Port Group, one of the biggest Chinese state-owned enterprises, took over a 99-year lease in Hambantota port. And this was sort of it drew the ire of the international scholarly community, and a lot of, politicians, a lot of analysts and critics very quickly started to focus on Sri Lanka. And in recent years, after 2019 or so, less attention has been given to Sri Lanka. So when I started my PhD in 2020, I figured it would be good to actually come here to see what's actually happening here and to unravel some of the intricacies of not just China's footprint here, but also how this all relates to Sri Lanka's own political and economic situation.
Okay, so I think coming to Sri Lanka, all Sri Lankans, especially our audience, will notice that the Chinese footprint has grown spectacularly, shall we say. But that doesn't mean that Sri Lanka's relationship with China is new. It doesn't mean Sri Lanka has had a long relationship since the 1950s with the rubber rice pact, which we've heard of. So, how do you view this? How should Sri Lankans view the Chinese investments in Sri Lanka, and what is your advice in terms of, because as you mentioned, I'll just let you in on what I see in Sri Lanka is that there's a very, especially for example, if I can give you an example, when Mike Pompeo came to Sri Lanka a few years ago, most of the national newspapers were very sort of antagonistic towards the United States, especially Mr. Pompeo, as Secretary of State, made some very interesting remarks about Chinese investments, and it was very obvious, sort of, it wasn't subtle at all. It was trying to make us, say, choose the United States over China, etc. So a lot of Sri Lankans, I think intrinsically, maybe because of our colonial history, we view the West with a certain amount of suspicion. Now, there's obviously a Western-centric media even in Sri Lanka, and there's a liberal media in Sri Lanka, and they view Chinese investment with a little bit of suspicion. So I want you to tell us, Sri Lankans, should we be suspicious of China? Should we be suspicious of the West? What's your take on this suspicion? And I think this suspicion is not just to Sri Lanka. It's in a lot of places where China has entered, and there's this contradiction between the liberal Western model and the Chinese model. So I know I've put a lot on your plate, but just walk us through that a little bit.
No, but it's an interesting situation because obviously, as you mentioned, Sri Lanka and China have very long-standing, very mutually beneficial relations, going all the way back to ancient traders like Admiral Zheng coming from China, the Buddhist monk and scholar Fa Xian coming from China to Sri Lanka to study Buddhism here and bringing back scholarly texts and all of these kinds of things. So there's been a very long mutual understanding between the two countries, and I mean 1952 the Rubber Rights Pact, and then the establishing of official relations in 1957. We've obviously seen the friendship grow in a lot of ways during the years, and especially during the Civil War, I think China was quite, let's say they proved the friendship to Sri Lanka by giving a lot of support, both in terms of armaments and rations and all of these kinds of things, but also political support. And I think this is one of the things that, when we're thinking about now the relationship, it strikes me that we have seen China and Sri Lanka now over the last, say, two years, especially during COVID, but also now during the debt restructuring process. We've seen the two countries move apart quite a bit. There's been a lot of frictions, especially when it comes to the IMF deals and all of these kinds of things. And I think now a lot of Sri Lankans are starting to take a little bit more cautious view when it comes to China than has been the case in the past. I think, generally speaking, most Sri Lankans have had a very positive impression. At least that's my understanding, and that's the people that I've spoken to here have given me the similar kind of view on the matter. But I would also say that it's a difficult situation because of many, many things, especially the geopolitical rivalry in general between the West, especially the Quad countries, so the US, Australia, India, Japan, and also, of course, China then on the other hand, and I mean all of the other smaller players that are interested in sort of vying for influence in Sri Lanka due to its very strategic importance in the Indo-Pacific. I think this is one of the things that reflects itself in all of these matters when we talk about China's footprint, but also when we talk about all of these negative perceptions on China. We have to take into account that there's a lot of, there's a lot of contesting views taking place. There's a lot of criticism that is rooted in, let's say, different ways in which the different Western governments have sort of tried to portray China during the years because of issues such as you can say the China threat theory in general, that China's power is growing, so now we have to contain China. And I'm not here to say that China should go unchecked. Not at all. I'm just here to say that we have to view China's influence here in view or in light of all of these things. And obviously, as a regular Sri Lankan person, it can be really difficult to sort of unpack the difficult situation of the country, economically and politically, but also what is China actually doing here? What is China's the sort of overarching goals of Chinese investments? And I think for most people, this is a very opaque landscape. And this is what we see in other countries as well, not just in South Asia, but also in European ports such as Rotterdam and Piraeus in Greece and all of these kinds of places in which China has been making inroads in recent years and has been sort of doubling down on its influence. And I think generally speaking, the suspicion is always going to be there, and I think that's a natural byproduct in a sense of China's increasing presence, but also China's increasing influence in a lot of different spheres. And I would say, generally speaking, the way I see it, the investments have had certain benefits. They've also had certain detrimental effects. But I would say that the same has been true for a lot of other investments coming from other countries. Now, we've seen in recent years a lot of countries, I term this sort of geopolitical proxy war taking place in Sri Lanka, or even some sort of geopolitical financial warfare between the big powers taking place in Sri Lanka. So this is something that has been growing, and I mean, especially now, as I said, China's rise and also China sort of retaking its place at the center of the world's political stage. These kinds of rivalries and things will take place more and more often.
As you mentioned, right in the center of geopolitics, global geopolitics, and as we speak, I mean, a few days ago, the Secretary of State of the United States, Secretary Anthony Blinken, was in China. He met top Chinese officials, including Xi Jinping. So, I mean, I suppose we can hope for some sort of a thawing of relations going forward. But it just shows, doesn't it, now, one of the things that I think the Western perspective always likes to point out is that, you know, democracies such as Sri Lanka is one of the oldest, probably the oldest democracy in Asia. And, you know, we should, by the fact of us being democratic, we should be more aligned with the United States versus China. But I want to just give our audience an idea, and you've lived in China, you've studied the country. Can you tell us briefly what the political system is like in China? Because I think people seem to think that China has no democratic input from the people. But that's not strictly true, because China has quite a few elections, does it not? So could you give us a brief idea on what China's political system is like?
Right. So, I mean, the very brief summary of all of this, because obviously it's a big topic in its own right, is that China is a single-party state in all respects. So the Chinese Communist Party is at the sort of the top position of power, and even though there are elections, most of the other parties are quite small, and it's usually quite localized as well. So there are no real contenders to the sort of overarching power of the CCP. We have seen in recent years, especially with increased calls. Now, I mean, China's been growing richer and richer during recent years, and we see the middle class and also the more affluent elites in the bigger cities calling for increased the increased ability to sort of just have some sort of stake, to have some sort of say in what actually takes place in politics. And in view of this, China has introduced different measures, such as what is termed consultative democracy, and all of these kinds of things, in which you have different, I wouldn't necessarily call them direct consultations, but for example, top officials will meet with, let's say, local officials or local stakeholders in different contexts, and they will be talking about, for example, food safety. What can be done to improve food safety measures? What can be done to improve environmental protection measures, and these kinds of things. So we see these kinds of things more and more often now.
At the very local level, are people in China voting for their local representatives of the CCP? Do they choose between two? I mean, I know that they're all from the CCP, but can people at the very local, regional level, in the village level, can they choose who represents them at the CCP?
I will say while there is some consultation going on in this area, usually most officials, even the quite local ones, are appointed directly from the central government. So this structure is quite clear in the sense that it's more like a pyramid structure with Xi Jinping and the Politburo Standing Committee at the top. Then under that, the Politburo proper, so this also quite small body of elite politicians. And then under that, we see the National People's Congress and all of these other more, I mean, still politically influential, but still subservient to the sort of larger leading small groups and all of these things that are charting ideology and charting overarching policy. So the way in which it works is still that the CCP, the central core of the CCP, dictates all the different policies, and all of the sort of the central government, the provincial governments, the local governments, they just follow suit when it comes to these things. And this is also to ensure, now Xi Jinping is an interesting political figure in that he has completed a number of anti-corruption campaigns since he rose to power in 2012 and 2013. And now you can say, I mean, he is the paramount leader in China. He is the president of the country, but his real power lies in the fact that he's general secretary of the CCP. So he just started his third term now. And he has really taken on an importance that is quite unlike what we've seen for many years, actually. So Deng Xiaoping was one of the proponents of this collective leadership, as it's called, in which the CCP Central Core, the Politburo Standing Committee in particular, has a much more consultative process within itself. And under Xi Jinping, we've seen a more assertive China, but we've also seen a more like re-centralization actually of power under Xi himself. So Xi now spearheads a lot of large projects. He spearheads quite a lot of, let's say, the charting of general policies, but he also the leading small groups that are in charge of different things. So he's actually quite influential as a person.
I just want to go to this, because Xi Jinping is such an important figure in international politics now,
right,
because of China's strength, economic capability, military capability. But in this, China's previous leaders have all been very influential on China. So you mentioned Deng Xiaoping, Mao Zedong. But I want you to just explain to our audience, as we look at figures from history like Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong, we see them as these larger than life, founding father figures of China. But explain to the audience briefly what Xi Jinping now represents, because if I'm not mistaken, Xi Jinping has now placed himself, or he has been placed in that echelon of the historic leaders of China, the people that are considered as central to the Chinese project, the Chinese Communist project. And Deng Xiaoping thought, and now we have Xi Jinping thought. So can you tell us a little bit, just briefly, on that?
Right. So going back to, Mao Zedong is perhaps the most well-known Chinese politician of all time. He's the one that most people recognize instantly. But after his death, Deng Xiaoping, so Mao Zedong was essentially, he was a proponent of taking Marxism-Leninism as its sort of the core ideology of the Communist Party, but then combining that with Chinese characteristics. So essentially suiting Marxism-Leninism to Chinese particularities and the Chinese society in general. And so this was introduced as a sort of core tenet from the sort of establishment of the Communist Party in 1921, and especially it took on prominence after 1949 when the People's Republic of China was established after the Civil War and all of these things happened. So Mao Zedong was perhaps the first person who took Marxism-Leninism and sort of shaped it into his own thing, because he felt that in China we just have certain societal features that make it impossible to directly adopt the Soviet model. So taken that, from that, Deng Xiaoping then went in a slightly more pragmatic direction. He essentially argued under him for a more pragmatic turn with what was termed socialism with Chinese characteristics. And so essentially this was about combining some market forces, allowing some market forces, because ultimately socialism would have to go through a little bit, the stages would be a little bit longer in China as opposed to other countries. Then after that, other leaders after him, so Jiang Zemin, for example, also with the 3% and all of these things, sort of doubled down on this, we'll let some capitalists actually into the communist power because they're still doing honest labor for the good of the socialist revolution and these things. And then now we've up to 2017 with the installment of Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era into the Chinese constitution. We've essentially seen both a doubling down on the fact that China is such a particular country, so you can't just make these measures straight. You have to adapt in certain steps and all of these things. But we've also seen under Xi then under Deng Xiaoping we had this responsive diplomacy, as it was called. So a much more wait and see. He had this very famous dictum of hide your strength and bide your time. So under Xi Jinping we've seen a much more assertive China, but also China that essentially does something it strives for achievement on the international stage. It strives to become more global. It strives to become more visible, and with that, also there's a growing sense under Xi's leadership, and this is what he represents. That China has now taken on it's, as I said, come back to the center of the world's political stage, but it's also taken on a role that is much more all-encompassing in the world political system than has previously been the case. So China now is charting out a lot of new routes and roads into the world. We saw this starting in the 1980s with the going global, all of these different strategies in which China wanted to integrate itself better into the world economic and financial system. But now we see this sort of to an even larger extent. I mean, 2013 with the Belt and Road Initiative obviously marked the start of this process, but in recent years, China has also started, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, and these different things that are essentially heralding a new era in which China is trying to establish this shared future, like this community of shared destiny for all mankind. And this is essentially about allowing China to take its place as a sort of humane authority or benevolent ruler on the world stage, rivaling the US, rivaling the US in terms of perhaps becoming the world's new hegemon, but also rivaling in terms of becoming an alternative governance pole, becoming an alternative norm shaper in the international system rather than just a norm taker. So we see essentially now China is going out. It's becoming more and more, let's say, ingrained and integrated within the world sphere. And so we call this phenomenon global China. So essentially China's glowing economic, financial, but also especially political footprint in the world. And this is what Xi Jinping very much represents for the Chinese people, this China that is sort of has risen up from 100 years of humiliation. All of these colonial, the colonial periods that have been taking place in China are now gone. It's all over, and China is sort of taking its rightful place in the world.
So it's a new, more confident, more international, a globally engaged China, essentially. Right. So before we go to the BRI and the global engagement, I just want to give people an idea, if you could help me. The Chinese economic miracle, as it's called, is nothing short of a miracle, is it not? Because the number of people that have been raised out of poverty from below the poverty line to essentially a middle class and a low middle class, it's numbers in the hundreds of millions. And just since our lifetimes, I mean, from the 80s, 90s to today, the image of China, the perceptions of China have completely changed. Now, for example, you mentioned the United States and the strategic threat of a hegemonic China, or the threat of being a multipolar world or a bipolar world. Okay, but the Americans have had deep interests in China leading up to the Chinese Communist Revolution with the Kuomintang. In fact, the previous regime in China before the communists took over escaped to Taiwan. And it's well known that if you want to read original Chinese literature, Chinese art, culture, before the Communist Revolution, you have to go to Taiwan. And now we see the chain, and if I use the word chain, so I'll remind our audience that American foreign policy has by design encircled China with military bases. So anyone can go and check Google. You can go just type American bases around China, and you'll see a quite clear encirclement. And that's not by accident, that's part of a design. It's called the First Island Chain. It's meant to be the first line of defense against a China that wants to launch attacks throughout the world. So this is sort of the framing of the issue that the West has sort of given us. So just touching on the Chinese story, could you tell us a little more about why they decided to go for the Belt and Road Initiative? And I mean, people view the Belt and Road Initiative as purely transactional, right? It's about, you give us some money and we'll develop a port, and then it helps your trade, and it's a very clear sort of a circle of things that are happening. But now we think there might be more to that with these conversations around debt trap diplomacy. So before we come to debt trap diplomacy, just talk to us about the introductions of the Belt and Road Initiative and what it's all about.
Right. So, I mean, in short, China's economic transformation started in the 1980s. That was when it truly started to take place after Deng Xiaoping took over power. And as I said before, Deng was a much more pragmatic leader. So he truly believed in actually taking some market forces and having them sort of develop the economy in a much more in a much more flexible manner, really. So this is when it all started. We call this the opening up and reform era, because this was really when China opened up to the outside world. This is when China became more integrated, but also when a number of reforms were introduced in China that actually managed, or they allowed for certain sectors to really grow exponentially. And special economic zones were a big part of this, of course. So this is also why we see now, even today, China uses decentralized models, experimental models, when it comes to building up, let's say, economic infrastructures. China's also doing this in the BRI today, but I can get back to that. But even back then, Shekou and Shenzhen is perhaps one of the best examples of China's economic transformation, because what started out as a tiny, sleepy fishing village really grew very, very quickly through the joint efforts of the government and the local officials there that started to do experimental policymaking practices that would allow the special economic zone to flourish, and essentially infrastructure was constructed in incremental steps to make sure that the process was facilitated in the best way possible. Now, why I'm saying all of this is because this is exactly what China is still doing with the BRI. China Merchants Port Shekou was the first actually to implement this very experimental model when it comes to this specific port design. And this was what made Shenzhen grew exponentially. China essentially took this model, put it back into national practice, and then exported it from Shekou to other ports in China. And now China has, had some trial and error, I would say. In China we have this saying of crossing the river by feeling the stones. And this is exactly what this model is all about. It's about going, as I said, in an incremental and flexible manner and making sure that you actually, step by step, build up the different capacities, and you do this in a way that mitigates any risk, that mitigates any problematic issues that can arise with governance practices and all of these things. And that's just to say, this was the sort of, let's say, very small start of what we can now see in the Belt and Road. China Merchants Port, as I said, is still one of the biggest exporters of the Belt and Road initiative globally, and of course, since I focus on the 21st century maritime Silk Road, which is part of the Belt and Road initiative in itself. This is still very much used today. This is a model in which China, as I said, they export the so-called Shekou Moshi, so the Shekou model, or the PPC, the Port Park City model, to different countries, and then they essentially make sure that the creation of the special economic zones, the creation of infrastructure, industry, and all of these related things links up with the hinterland, links up in a conducive manner to make sure that it becomes a financial hub, transshipment hub, and all of these things. And that's just to say that all of China's economic miracle, all of these things that had happened in China, the building up of massive infrastructure, like the road net, the internet when that started, all of these things we've seen in China when it comes to these massive drives of building up, and also the expansion of the capacity of different sectors, is essentially what led to the Belt and Road Initiative being designed from top Chinese policymakers, including Xi Jinping. So China has always had a problem, for many years after the opening up and reform period, has had a problem of overcapacity and overproduction. So essentially you would have sectors, state-driven sectors, in which, say, the steel sector and these kinds of sectors would overproduce. They would simply have too much on their hands. And so the Belt and Road Initiative, after the state-owned enterprises started to go global way back in the 1980s, decided, well, this is actually, we need to do something about this problem. So a way in which to mitigate this issue, and in which to, there are plenty of other targets that the Belt and Road was also filling, such as handling the, let's say, the shift between one kind of economic model to a different one, and all of these kinds of things. So making China more self-sustainable, but also making sure that China gets more integrated into the wider world, and make sure that the US can't directly contain it, and all of these things, is to take all of this overcapacity and export it elsewhere. And that has been one of the sort of driving things with Belt and Road from the beginning, because it is a mega infrastructure initiative. So this is really one of the interesting things that I believe quite a lot of, let's say, very critical policymaking literature overlooks. From China's side, it's always been about making sure that China's economy stays stable, China's sort of production capacity is taken care of in different places. But of course, there's also the political angle. And you said the transactional nature, and I think this is what we see now the most, probably, because it's true that, there is a very clear, let's say, political motivation behind it, in the sense that China builds all of these things. It makes sure that there are plenty of investments going to other countries, at least this before COVID, but we can get back to that. So it makes sure that all of these things are taken care of, that there's, let's say, a certain incentive for policymakers and politicians in different countries to work with China bilaterally, but also, of course, work with China on the multilateral forums. And China is getting different things out of this. I mean, access to strategic resources, better transshipment, like, let's say, better access to sea lanes of communication and all of these kinds of things. But of course also political support when China needs it. And as I also mentioned earlier, I mean, global China, this phenomenon of China sort of becoming more and more influential on the world stage, also means, as I said, such issues as the China threat theory being developed by academics and the policymakers in Western countries. And China realizes that this is a huge issue. So China is essentially increasingly trying to portray itself as a benevolent power that is out to help other countries. So portraying the Belt and Road Initiative as South-South cooperation and all of these kinds of things, trying to make sure that it shows that, you know, developing countries can rely on China as a model to follow, but also as a sort of, as I said, alternative to the US, because the US in many developing countries, very fairly, I think, is usually viewed as a colonizing power more than anything. And China is trying to make it very clear that China is not doing the same kind of thing. It has this non-interference strategy in these
So
things.
I want to just touch on that because it's interesting you use the words the American model, where it's linked to colonization, and the non-interference that's linked to, I think China has a policy of non-interference in other countries' internal affairs, correct? That's the official policy. Now, whether that's actually happening in practice is a different story.
Right.
But I just want to contrast, I mentioned before that in Sri Lanka especially, there's a Western sort of, we're antagonistic towards the West for various reasons, and we tend to mistrust the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe, etc. Using that basis, if you look at, okay, so the basic worry is that the United States and the West are trying to take advantage of Sri Lanka. Then you look at China, they've done all this investment into Sri Lanka, built ports, roads, and infrastructures. But if you look at where Sri Lanka stands today, and this is where it's going to be really interesting for Sri Lankans, is that it's not America that owns a port in Sri Lanka, or it's not America that funded an airport which didn't have planes. It's China, and it's China that, for example, has another 99-year lease on the Colombo port city as well, which is on the doorstep of India, and Sri Lanka exists in what we like to call, and what India thinks is their sphere of influence, right? So having such significant Chinese footprints in Sri Lanka, whilst being in India's sphere of influence, presents its own issues. Right. But how do you contrast this? And this is not unique to Sri Lanka. There are many projects around the world, Pakistan, I think, Kazakhstan. There's many of these Belt and Road Initiative projects that either have been trimmed down, they've completely stalled, or the Chinese government has basically withdrawn from it. And when you take that and you look at Sri Lanka and this particular view we have of China, is it justified? Because they seem to have you mentioned strategic resources around the world. Now they've clearly got some strategic resources in China. So I'm just putting it to you, sort of a devil's advocate, if I may. Is it true that China's really benign, that it's really transactional? Because it seems like they've got a 99-year lease on a port, they've got a 99-year lease on the port city. Can we really say that Chinese influence is simply transactional? Can we say that?
I think it's an interesting, and I mean, this is also, I have to say, it's a very complex issue, and I don't mean to say that the West is inherently colonizing anyone, or that China.
These are all perceptions, right?
Right. And especially the let's say the understanding of China's interests and of China's goals is obviously very much eye of the beholder kind of thing. I mean, will always be, there will always be a lot of different opinions about this. I think generally speaking, it's quite clear to me at least that China has a lot of, I mean, let's say, there are the overt goals with the strategy of the Belt and Road Initiative, and there are the covert goals. And I definitely believe that China has, to a quite large extent, quite benign intentions when it comes to these things, because it's also important for China to, let's say, build up capacity so that it will become, let's say, the world will become more financially integrated and more goods will be exported from China. And I mean, there are a lot of for other countries to do something like this, they would have a similar intention. So that's also what I always try to think about. I mean, with rivaling infrastructure initiatives, usually there are certain things that are expected from the government that they will get out of this, whether it be the G7 Build Back Better World strategy, whether it's the EU Commission Global Gateway strategy, whether it's the Japan strategy, the India strategy. I mean, there are quite a lot of contenders. There are quite a lot of rival infrastructure strategies that would have similar goals. And I think in this respect, we can't blame China, so to speak, for having different motivations, especially when it comes to actually having access to these ports, to having these financial integrations and so on and so forth.
And in a way, hasn't China sort of brought about this trend of massive infrastructure investments from the United States with Build Back Better, with Japan from its better quality infrastructure, and so it's sort of with India as well in our region.
Right.
So it's sort of been a boon for investments, hasn't it? It's sort of because these other major nations that probably not have been interested in investing in our infrastructure now are thinking, well, we better because China's getting in there, we have to compete with them. So in a way, it's sort of driven this infrastructure investment program globally, hasn't it?
It has, and I mean, that is, I think, one of the, let's say, happier takeaways from all of this, right? But it's definitely also true that there have been a lot of issues when it comes to the Belt and Roads implementation in different countries, and there have been a lot of quite contentious things happening.
So I think this is a good time to talk about debt trap diplomacy as well. So if you want to.
Exactly, and this is one of the things that it's one of the perhaps most discussed memes, as we call it, the debt trap diplomacy meme. And I mean,
how do you view that meme? Do you think there's something to it? Do you think it's? I know it's a controversial thing to discuss, but how would you approach it?
I mean, from the way I see it, there have certainly been some let's say less beneficial investments being made, and this is essentially what my project is about: is unpacking all of these intricacies of the different investments and finding out exactly what went wrong, where, and with whom the fault, if that is the way to put it, is to be put. But I do think that now, in recent years, we've seen very, very good work from Sri Lankan scholars, for example, like Umesh Murumudali and Hila Panduwala, taking these things and unpacking them and actually saying what has actually been taking place. Deborah Brodikim from the Johns Hopkins University in the US has also been quite frequently writing about the so-called debt trap diplomacy. And I think at this moment you can say that the myth of Chinese debt trap diplomacy as like a very specific strategy has been dispelled. That's not to say that there aren't white elephant projects. That's not to say that some of these projects are definitely not meeting the targets and are definitely not beneficial for the people. And this is essentially where I position myself. I try to figure out why did this actually come to this point and what is actually taking place now. What are the remedies that can be sort of done for this? And I mean, I can return and talk about where the Belt and Road is at right now, but I think generally speaking, I can at least say that my impression of Sri Lanka is that there have been certain issues from both sides of the bilateral relationship when it comes to China and Sri Lanka, when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative investments, especially in the ports of Hambantota and Colombo. And I think this is one of the things that going forward, it's going to be, it will continue to be a make or break it point for China's influence in Sri Lanka, whether these ports actually become more financially viable than they currently are, and in which form this would sort of take shape. Generally speaking, I can say that I think there have been missteps and a certain amount of mismanagement from both China's side, but also from Sri Lankan side when it comes to the elite stakeholders that were involved in the project. Now, I know this is also a bit controversial, but the Rajapaksa family has had quite a big role in these projects, and I don't believe that the projects have always been utilized or put in place in a way that was truly conducive to what they could actually be if, say, the infrastructure investments had been made in a different manner, if the projects had been linked up in a different manner. So that's just to say, I'm not here to assign blame, I'm just here to say there have been issues, and the same goes for other countries where the Belt and Road has been installed in different projects, such as Djibouti, for example, where we see the same thing happening with some elite stakeholders that have certain interests in implementing the project in a certain way, that have certain interests in skimming off the profits in a certain way to suit their own, let's say, voting base or constituency, whatever it is. And this essentially means that the projects fall short or they fall flat compared to what they could be. And at the same time, I think China, for its part, and I say China, but I mean really the Chinese central government, the CCP, but also the Chinese state-owned enterprises, for their role in the matter, have fallen short in several respects. I think in some ways, China has been negligent, I would say, when it comes to the implementation and the governance of the projects, because China has not, in certain ways, done its homework when it comes to Sri Lanka's own political and economic situation. So I think, and this is something that I see in a lot of different places, it's not just here that's taking place, but it's a big problem when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, that all of the emphasis is put on China. Of course, quite a lot of the, let's say, China's still sort of steering the project, so China's still at the end of the negotiation table when it comes to these things. But I still think we have to unpack the reality of Chinese investments and to really truly see that Chinese foreign policy, including the Belt and Road Initiative, is a lot more responsive, decentralized, flexible, and a lot more pragmatic than we actually seem to think. So China, rather than being viewed as this very monolithic power that just suppresses Sri Lankan interests and all of these things, is actually a lot more responsive to bottom-up bargaining and negotiations and all of these things. However, I also see that Sri Lanka has, shown considerable agency when it comes to certain parts of the initiative, but there are also certain things in which the government has not perhaps done all it could. And of course, this is also a very opaque process, and this is part of the issue. We don't have that much documentation when it comes to how these different things have been, let's say, the selection process, the feasibility studies, all of these things, that we are actually lacking certain dimensions, which also means that it's hard to adequately assess what has actually been taking place and who actually called the shots on which parts of the process and so on and so forth. But the very sort of brief overarching takeaway from this is that it takes two to tango. Yes. And with the Belt and Road Initiative, for sure, I think we need to pay more attention to host country agency issues, to host country agency in general when it comes to actually bargaining for better Belt and Road deals. And this has been taking place now. I mean, you said certain projects have been called back or, like, say, reshaped, or, these kinds of things have been taking place. And this is true in different countries. We see that different countries have now started to say, well, we don't really believe that China has our best interests at heart, or we don't believe that these rates are the best. We don't believe these loans are the best. So can we restructure? Can we do something different? And a lot of these countries have done this over political fears, but a lot of countries have also done this over more economic, let's say, motivations. So seeing Sri Lanka for many countries has actually been a watershed moment, I think. Like seeing Sri Lanka with the 99-year lease of Hambantota Port to China merchants, but also now all of the debates about sovereignty that have taken place in Port City, whether they're true or not. I'm not here to really get into that. I'm just here to say a lot of other countries are taking cues from these things and saying, hold up, we need to make sure that China actually is accountable when it comes to these things. And conversely, I also think that a lot of other developing countries that have very weak governance regimes also need to make sure that they take accountability when it comes to these things.
So I think you mentioned what I believe is probably what's going on, is that there's a certain amount of elite capture going on between the Chinese investments and the local political power centers, right? So when you mentioned the Rajapaksa family, so it's a very clear sort of arc. Post-war, 2009, the war ended. the rest of the world was sort of going through a financial crisis. China became the global engine of growth with, all they bought up record numbers of US Treasury bills, for instance, and then the Belt and Road Initiative a few years later. So we've seen this clear arc, and the Rajapaksa family happened to be in power at this time. And it's not surprising then that most of the large investments came up in Hambantota, which is their main city, town. Now, looking at that model that's happened in Sri Lanka, and you mentioned Umesh Muramudli, for instance, and their conversations around the myth of, I say myth in inverted commas, the myth of Chinese imperialism, shall we say, and then the debt trap diplomacy conversation. If we just briefly take the Hambantota report, for instance, I read that piece by Tilina and Umesh, and it was very interesting. There's been a few responses to their study as well, saying that they've sort of ignored a few aspects of it. Now, with that, let's just briefly take the Hambantota port, the Magampura port project. Anyone can see that Sri Lanka needed a port that has a good industrial connection to it, okay? Because the Colombo port, it's not the most accessible, it's right at the top of Fort. There's a lot of traffic in Colombo most of the time. So it makes perfect sense to have a large port which is designed for purpose, built for purpose. But somehow that port was never able to take off. It was never able to reach the capacity. I don't think it still reached the capacity that it should. At the same time, we had the debts to pay. And then in 2015-16, the new government, the Yahapalne government under the current president, he was prime minister at the time, they signed the agreement, the 19 annual lease agreement, right? So that was at the time reported as a debt to equity swap. But now we notice, and that's some of the work that Umesh and them did as well, is that there wasn't actually a debt to equity swap. It was just literally we settled some debts and put the rest of the money into our reserves, and China took ownership of the port. And we still have the loans, the majority of the loans taken for the port. So it seems to me it chimes with what you're saying. What you're saying is that, look, Chinese are there, they have the money, they want to invest, but it's really up to the local government to exercise their agency, right? It's not about just saying, oh, give us the money and we'll do what we want with it, but it's about using this proposition that China is giving to you and maximizing its gains for the people. So in that sense, it seems that it's not China that's necessarily failed Sri Lanka. It's the Sri Lankan government that's sort of been unable to make the most of Chinese investments. Would you agree with that?
I mean, it's a very complex issue. I still think China has fallen short in a number of respects. I don't think that China truly recognized what was going on at the time they were starting to. And I mean, it's obviously it's a difficult situation, because when you come in and you say, I have money to invest, have you done feasibility studies? Have you actually made sure that this is the place you want the port? Is it going to benefit the locals? Is it going to, I mean, I don't know what exactly the questions were that were being asked during this process. It's all very opaque, as I said. But if China had gone in and said, okay, so have you done all of this? Have you actually made sure? And the government says, yeah, sure, of course, we have.
Have you seen, now you're studying Sri Lanka, have you been able to get information about the feasibility studies for example, Hambantota Port, or for any project? Have you been able to see feasibility studies, recommendations, approvals? How do you view all the process?
Very, very generally, I can say that there have been feasibility studies made during different parts of the process, and some of them, I believe, are still not known to the public, which is also what happens due to, I mean, a lot of different things in this, of course, the Sri Lankan bureaucratic system, the fact that things are not digitalized. So there's been a lot of things. More importantly, I also think that during the construction of these ports, during the investment phase, there was a lot going on in terms of just making sure that things actually took off, that something actually happened, that there would actually be, let's say, a process started to build up the industry to do all of these things. So in that respect, I think a lot of this documentation came later. I mean, it became secondary really to what was, let's just make sure we actually get something off the ground. Right. Because now we have the money, we need to make sure. So, I mean, one of the things I identify as also problematic is that China has, of course, invested in the port much longer than the Belt and Road has been around. So this has been like a very slow process with different installments. I mean, China took an interest very early on, 2006, 2007. So this has been a slow process, but there has been a certain tendency, let me put it like that, in the Sri Lankan government to see things in a quite short-term view. So always in 4-year increments, let's make sure we just win the power, we keep the power, and then we try to win the next election. And when the governments change like this, it becomes very, very difficult to actually follow up on these development projects, to follow up on these infrastructure projects. So that's one of the things I identify as quite problematic, is the changes in government, the changes in government policy, and the fact that these are not national development projects. These are not, let's say, instated by like how do I put it, a more independent government, or like even a more independent...
They're more towards the whims and fancies of individuals.
Right, and so I think that's a big problem. I think, again, it's not necessarily, it's not just Sri Lanka's fault. China has also been utilizing this to some extent, I think. And China has, if China wanted to stop the project because China was afraid of economic mismanagement or something like this, they could have also perhaps been more vocal about this. Ultimately, I think, on the Chinese side of things, one of the problems has been that part of the process, China has not perhaps been as, let's say, one thing is that they've been more negligent about certain aspects, but another thing is that they could have done more to bring in the Sri Lankan side as well. They could have consulted more. They could have brought in, let's say, top Sri Lankan, not just officials, but also people that are technically trained in these matters in the ports and that know the areas quite well. Okay. I think this could have been done to a much larger extent.
I want to finish off with 2 questions, Tabita. The first one, it's probably more difficult for you to answer. So, in Australia, for instance, a few years ago, there was a report by the Australian government detailing what it called Chinese political interference, entrenchment in Australian politics. And since then, we've seen a lot of moves by the Australian government. We've seen a lot of rhetoric from the Australian media that's very anti-China. So Australia, for whatever reason, have sort of taken a lead in showing that it's not just infrastructure. There's also political entrenchment. There's some involvement. There's interference. There's pressure. I think they found evidence of Chinese funding towards local political campaigns. So it was quite localized as well in Australia. There's all sorts of conversations in Sri Lanka about Chinese interference and about money going into politics, about China funding electoral campaigns. We mentioned the Rajapaksa's, that's something that's been spoken about. How do you view that? Is there something insidious or something a little bit that we should be suspicious of China, not in terms of the financial investment, but in terms of how it is seeking to gain influence in local politics through political individuals? Is something that's come up in your research?
I think it's certainly a factor, and it's a factor in many countries. China's doing this not just in Australia, but in a lot of different countries. And I know China has also financed different presidential campaigns in Sri Lanka. So
is that right?
It's not exactly a new thing.
So you're saying that's a fact?
There have been different investments being made to.
You have data that supports that?
There are different articles, and most of these are open source. Okay. So, and this is, it's just to say that sometimes they don't come. Sometimes these money doesn't come directly from the Chinese government. They come from state-owned enterprises. They come from different other, or they can come in the form of different gifts, different, let's say, how do I put it? Access to different things. These kinds of incentives, right? So, but I think that this is, again, we have to sort of, not to play the devil's advocate too much, but just to say that we also have to recognize that this is happening in geopolitics in general. This is like a great power rival kind of thing. We do see that the US has also made significant, contributions to different places in different governance structures. There's been a lot of this taking place, generally speaking. I'm not trying to say that China has no fault in this whatsoever. I'm just trying to say that, unfortunately, it is a big factor when it comes to politics, and especially in developing countries where China really wants to have a stake, really wants to have a say, that really wants to make sure. China's been making sure that it would have access to, let's say, different politicians, I think, and not necessarily just the ruling, but also the opposition, especially in recent years. So this is something that I've seen in different places. This is also something we've seen, not necessarily in Scandinavia in the same sense, but what we have had, for example, is the 100 Flowers program, or the 1,000, I think it's the 100 or it's the 1,000 Flowers program. This is essentially a program in which China has been trying to make sure that it had access, strategic access to certain key researchers and stuff like this that were gaining incentives to. So we do see stuff like this. I mean, it's quite clear that there is a concerted effort, but I would just say it's quite clear that China has a strategy with this. It's quite clear that there are certain political motivations at play. I would just say I do believe that a lot of other countries would do or are doing the same thing. And that's, again, not to shift the blame or to take the load off, but just to say.
So Tabita, just to finish off, I guess my final question will be around what's in store. So China currently is going through some economic issues of its own.
Right.
Currently, I think GDP figures for Q2 haven't been released yet. Analysts haven't been able to. They're saying consumer confidence is apparently quite low. Manufacturing output is apparently quite low. Exports have fallen off a little bit. Then we had the collapse of China's largest property developer, Evergrande, and basically people, thousands of people protesting about they're losing their deposits on their housing, on their shelter. Quite apart from the zero COVID policy, which has had a huge impact on the Chinese economy. Given all of this, and I think there's a lot of analysis that suggests there will be a recession towards the end of this year, early next year, and some of it might flow from China, slow down. Given all of this, can you briefly tell us what the future of the Belt and Road Initiative is going forward? Because there's clearly going to be, there's rationalizing from the host countries. They're all thinking, maybe we should be a little careful, pulling back a little bit, being a little more selective. Right. And on the other side, China's also having economic problems of its own. They see their perception suffering because of Belt and Road Initiative projects that haven't worked out. So they're very mindful of their image, aren't they? They know how they're viewed, and they want to control that narrative as well. And given that Sri Lanka still needs so much investment, can we still depend on China as a development partner? Is China going to slow down with the Belt and Road Initiative? What's your point of view?
I mean, it's still early days, so it's hard to really judge right now. As you say, there's still some figures we haven't seen. But I think generally speaking, China has realized that perhaps it has been stretching itself a little bit too thin when it comes to certain investments. And the investment patterns we have seen have been, to a certain extent, detrimental to China's own economy, especially because the loans have just been extended and extended and extended. And I think China now realizes, okay, the next step is to perhaps move away from very, very heavy investments and move towards more soft power measures. So when I mentioned these new global initiatives, the global development, the global security, and all of these things, I mean, they are essentially about portraying China as a different, more, let's say, harmonious and a beneficial presence that is not rooted in just pure economical clout, you can say. I think this is going to be one of the things we see now. They are going to restructure perhaps the ways in which the loans are extended, the ways in which the investments are extended. I could at least imagine that. But I also do think that they're probably going to make sure that going forward, any investments that are made focus more on soft power measures, such as the Green Silk Road or the Health Silk Road, or all of these underlying branches of the Belt and Road Initiative that have been developing over the past few years. So things that afford China more credit in different sectors, that win more, let's say, people's hearts, that establish more people-to-people bonds, and all of these things, that is very much a part of making sure the initiative remains stable. And with that, I think we'll see perhaps a bit of a refocus from China's side, but I could be wrong. It could also, I mean, we've seen, a lot of changes and shifts, and the Chinese internal political structure is quite opaque. You never truly know what's going to take place, so we'll see what happens, I guess.
Well, that's very interesting, Tabita. So thanks a lot for your time with us, and all the best for your research in the future. And we hope we can have you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.